I was standing in my own kitchen holding my wife's phone, staring at a picture of her in a hotel room I had never seen, wearing the dress she told me she bought for a work dinner, and my best friend's arm was wrapped around her waist like it belonged there. That was the moment something inside me didn't explode, didn't shatter, didn't scream, but went completely still in a way that scared me more than rage ever could. The message thread above the photo was worse than the image itself. It wasn't just sex. It wasn't just secrecy. It was commentary. Mark had written, "I swear it's too easy. He has no idea. Borrowing someone else's wife feels like winning on expert mode." And Lily had replied with a laughing emoji and something about how I was too trusting for my own good. I read that line 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting what I was seeing. There were hotel confirmations, inside jokes about times they had met while I was at work, references to nights I remembered clearly because I had been texting her that I missed her. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't storm into the bedroom. I stood there and kept scrolling like I was reading a case study about someone else's marriage. Months, almost a year. It hadn't been a drunken mistake or some emotional lapse. It had been routine, planned, sustained. There were conversations about me, about how predictable I was, about how Mark enjoyed the challenge of keeping it hidden. He treated it like a sport, a competition, and I was the unaware referee standing in the middle of the field. The humiliation hit me in waves, but the sharpest part wasn't Lily's betrayal. It was his tone. Mark had been my best friend for 15 years. He had stood next to me at my wedding. He had toasted to our future. And in private, he reduced my marriage to a joke he could win. I kept thinking about the last time he came over, how he had clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're a lucky man, Ryan," with that easy grin that now felt like a mask I should have ripped off sooner. I heard Lily moving in the bedroom, humming softly like any other night. The normalcy of it made my stomach twist. I put the phone back exactly where I found it on the counter and walked into the living room, sitting down on the couch as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. She came out a few minutes later in a loose t-shirt and shorts, her hair still damp from the shower, and she leaned down to kiss the top of my head. "You look tired," she said gently. "Long day?" I looked up at her and saw the same face I had loved for years, the same eyes that had once looked at me like I was enough. I wondered how long she had been able to switch between those eyes and the ones she used in hotel rooms with him. "Yeah," I said evenly. "Just thinking." She smiled, completely unaware that I now knew every detail she had worked so hard to hide. She sat beside me, tucking her legs under herself, and started talking about something mundane from her day. I watched her lips move, studied the way her hand rested casually on my knee, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not fury, not heartbreak, something colder, something patient. 2 days later, I saw Mark at a mutual friend's barbecue. He walked up to me with a beer in his hand and that same confident grin. "You've been quiet lately," he said, pulling me into a half hug. "Marriage life finally boring you?" I searched his face for guilt, for hesitation, for any crack in the performance. There was none. He looked relaxed, amused. When Lily joined us a few minutes later, he didn't even flinch. He made eye contact with her like any normal friend would. If I hadn't seen the messages, I would have believed it. At one point, he leaned in slightly and said, "You really hit the jackpot with her, man. Don't ever let that one go." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. I realized in that moment that if I confronted them publicly, if I blew everything up right there, I would only be reacting. I would be the emotional one, the predictable one, and Mark would find a way to spin it, to downplay it, to treat it like a misunderstanding or some meaningless fling. So I did nothing. I shook his hand when he offered it. I smiled when he told a joke. I wrapped my arm around Lily's waist when she leaned into me, and I felt her body against mine, knowing exactly where that same body had been days before. The attraction didn't disappear instantly, which made everything more confusing. I still noticed the curve of her neck, the way her fingers traced idle patterns on my arm, the familiarity of her scent. Desire and disgust can exist in the same breath, and that realization made me feel even more alone. That night, lying next to her while she slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every message in my mind. He thought sleeping with my wife was a game. He thought I was the fool. He thought he was winning. What neither of them understood was that I wasn't going to scream, and I wasn't going to beg, and I wasn't going to make this easy. I was going to learn the rules first. I waited 3 days before I said anything, and those 3 days felt like living inside a glass box where everyone could breathe except me, because Lily kept brushing past me in the hallway and smiling like she hadn't been laughing at my trust in hotel rooms, and Mark kept texting me about a game on Sunday like he wasn't the same guy who wrote that borrowing someone else's wife line with the casual cruelty of someone flicking ash off a cigarette. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was I was testing them, watching how easily they wore their normal faces, watching how Lily would curl into my side on the couch and rest her hand on my chest, as if my heartbeat was something she deserved, watching how Mark would call me brother in front of people and look me straight in the eyes without blinking. There were moments when Lily would laugh at something on her phone, and I'd feel that old spark of wanting her, because she still knew how to tilt her head and look at me like she was inviting me into the version of us I thought was real, and it made me hate my own body for responding to her, because betrayal doesn't turn off attraction like a switch. It poisons it slowly while you're still thirsty. On the third night, after dinner, after she'd washed the dishes humming softly like we were a normal couple, she walked up behind me and slipped her arms around my waist, pressing her cheek between my shoulder blades while she murmured, "You've been distant lately, and I can feel it. And if I did something wrong, you should talk to me instead of shutting me out." And I stood there staring at the window over the sink, seeing my reflection layered over the dark outside, thinking about how easily she could say words like "talk to me" when she had been building a private language with someone else for months. I turned around slowly, held her gaze, and kept my voice level because if I sounded wounded, she would treat it like a weakness to manage. "I need you to sit down," I said, and even that small request made her eyes narrow in a way that told me she already sensed danger, not because she felt guilty, but because she hated not knowing what I knew. We sat at the table, the same table where she had planned vacations with me and talked about kids and laughed at my stupid stories, and I said, "I saw the messages, Lily, and I need you to tell me the truth without the performance, because I am not in the mood to be gaslit in my own house." And her face changed so quickly that it was almost impressive, shock turning into offense, turning into something like practiced sorrow. "What messages are you talking about, Ryan? Because that sounds insane, and I don't know why you're trying to start a fight like this," she replied. And for a second I understood exactly how she had gotten away with it for so long, because her voice was warm, wounded, believable, like she could sell rain to a drowning man. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I just said, "Mark, the hotels, the photos, the jokes about me being too trusting, the part where he called it winning, because apparently my marriage was a game to you both." And that was when her shoulders dropped a fraction and her eyes flickered away, not in remorse, but in calculation, like she was rearranging the story in real time. "It was just physical," she said finally, and the way she said it made my stomach turn, because she offered it like a discount, like she expected me to be relieved. "It didn't mean anything, and I never wanted to hurt you, and you've been stressed lately and distant, and I felt lonely, and Mark was there, and it got out of hand," she continued, stacking excuses like bricks between us, and I leaned back, letting her speak because I wanted to hear how she framed my pain as her circumstance. "You didn't want to hurt me," I repeated, slow and quiet. "But you laughed at him when he mocked me, and you kept doing it for almost a year, and you came home to my bed like I was a placeholder you could return to whenever you were done." She reached across the table for my hand, and I let her fingers touch mine for half a second before pulling away, because the familiarity of her touch felt like theft now. "Ryan, please," she said, voice thickening. "It was stupid. It was selfish, and I swear I ended it. And I swear I still love you, and you're the one I come home to. That line almost made me laugh, because it revealed the entire truth without meaning to, the way she saw loyalty as geography instead of devotion, as if coming home was the same as choosing me. The next day I called Mark and told him we needed to talk face to face, and he suggested a bar like we were meeting to watch highlights and complain about work. And when I walked in, he stood up with that same grin, slapped my shoulder and said, "You're looking intense, man. What's going on?" Because Lily didn't say anything, and I'm guessing this is about her mood lately. And the fact he brought her name up first told me everything. I stared at him until his smile thinned, and then I said, "I know." And he blinked like he didn't understand what I meant, like he could still pretend. "Know what, Ryan? Because you're being vague as hell and it's making me nervous," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. And I leaned forward, keeping my voice low because I didn't need an audience. I needed his face when he realized the mask was useless. "I know you've been sleeping with my wife. I know you've been using hotel rooms like they're a hobby. I know you wrote that line about borrowing her like I'm some idiot in a tutorial level. And I know you've been shaking my hand afterward like you're proud of it," I said. And for a second his expression froze, then snapped into denial so fast it was almost automatic. "That's crazy, man. I would never do that to you. You're my brother. And Lily must be manipulating you because she's emotional and she overreacts," he said. And I watched him reach for the oldest trick in the book, the one where he tried to put the woman on trial so the man could walk away clean. "Don't insult me," I replied, calm enough that it made him shift in his chair. "Because I saw the messages, Mark. And if you want to pretend you didn't write them, you're going to have to explain how your phone typed your jokes and your hotel confirmations and your little victory speech." His jaw tightened, and the denial softened into something uglier, something almost annoyed. "Okay, fine," he said, voice dropping. "It happened, but it wasn't like that, and it wasn't serious, and you're acting like she's property. And honestly, you two have been stale for a while, and she wanted excitement, and I didn't force her." He said stale like it was a diagnosis, like my marriage was already dead and he was just providing entertainment. And that was the moment I understood the second betrayal, because Lily had told me it meant nothing, and Mark had just told me it meant winning. I walked out of that bar without swinging, without shouting, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. And the coldest part was how clean it felt, like stepping out of a room where the air had been toxic and realizing you could breathe again. I went home, looked at Lily moving around the kitchen like she was waiting to see which version of me walked through the door. And I didn't tell her what Mark said because I didn't need another argument. I needed space to think, and I needed them comfortable enough to keep underestimating me. I slept on the couch that night, not because I was heartbroken in some dramatic way, but because I could feel the start of something else forming, something steady and deliberate. Because being replaced and mocked didn't just hurt, it clarified. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave. The moment I stopped feeling like a victim and started thinking like a strategist happened at a birthday party in Mark's backyard, surrounded by people who thought we were still just two couples who vacationed together and shared inside jokes. I was standing near the grill pretending to care about whether the steaks were overcooked when I heard my own name float through the air, followed by laughter that didn't sound friendly, and something in my chest tightened. Not from jealousy this time, but from recognition that humiliation has a specific tone when it's shared. Mark had a beer in his hand, leaning back like he owned the yard and everyone in it, and he was talking to two of our mutual friends who didn't know anything about the affair. "Some guys just don't realize when they're coasting," he said with a shrug that looked rehearsed. "And when you coast long enough, someone else steps in and drives." One of the guys laughed and asked what he meant, and Mark tilted his head toward the house where Lily was inside helping Sophie with drinks. "Let's just say excitement doesn't always stay where you parked it," he added, his voice low but not low enough. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike, which surprised me because a few weeks ago, that line would have sent me into blind rage. Now it felt like confirmation. He wasn't just betraying me privately. He was savoring it publicly in coded language, enjoying the idea that he had something over me. He caught my eye across the yard, and for a split second his expression shifted, because he realized I had heard enough. Then he smirked, subtle but deliberate, like he wanted me to react. I didn't. I walked over slowly, took a beer from the cooler, and stood beside him like nothing was off. "You talking about parking or about loyalty?" I asked calmly, meeting his gaze long enough to let him know I understood exactly what he was implying. He chuckled and clapped my shoulder. "Just talking about life, man," he said smoothly. "You know how it is. People get bored." Bored. That word landed heavier than the rest. It echoed with what Lily had said about things getting stale, about loneliness, about excitement. They had built a narrative where I was the predictable one, the safe one, the background noise in my own marriage. The worst part wasn't even that they believed it. It was that they had convinced themselves it justified what they did. Later that night, I watched Lily move through the party with a kind of nervous awareness, her eyes flicking between Mark and me more than usual. When she came up to me and slid her hand into mine, I could feel the tension in her grip. "You've been quiet," she said softly, searching my face for signs of confrontation. "Are you okay?" I studied her for a moment, noticing how effortlessly she could switch between public affection and private betrayal. "I'm fine," I replied, my tone level enough to unsettle her. "Just thinking." She leaned closer, her perfume familiar, her body warm against my side. There was still that undeniable pull when she touched me, and I hated how instinctively my hand rested on her waist, how my body remembered what my mind was trying to reject. Attraction doesn't disappear on command, and that tension made everything feel sharper. Across the yard, I saw Sophie standing alone for a moment, watching Mark laugh too loudly at his own joke. There was something in her expression I hadn't noticed before. Not ignorance, not bliss, something closer to resignation. She caught my eye briefly and offered a small, tired smile, the kind people give when they've stopped expecting honesty. That was when it clicked. Mark thought this was a game. He thought he had outplayed me. He thought he could flaunt coded insults in public, and I would either remain oblivious or explode and confirm his version of me as unstable and emotional. He wanted a reaction because reactions would make him feel powerful. So I gave him none. Instead, I started paying attention to Sophie in a way I hadn't before. Not flirtatiously, not obviously, just observant. The way she stiffened slightly when Mark put his arm around her. The way she laughed half a second too late. The way she seemed relieved when he walked away to refill his drink. As the party wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, Mark pulled me into a half hug again, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Don't overthink things, Ryan," he said, a faint grin on his face. "Sometimes you just have to accept when someone upgrades." Upgrade. He said it casually, but it was deliberate. I looked him straight in the eyes and smiled in a way that confused him. "You should be careful with words like that," I said evenly. "Sometimes upgrades come with hidden costs." He laughed it off, assuming I was bluffing or trying to sound clever, and that was the moment I knew something had shifted permanently. The humiliation that had sat heavy in my chest for weeks didn't disappear, but it transformed. It hardened. It focused. Driving home that night with Lily beside me, silent and watchful, I felt the anger settle into something colder and far more useful. I wasn't going to scream at him in a backyard or beg her to pick me over him. I wasn't going to play the wounded husband while he played the victorious friend. He thought he was winning because he had access to my wife. He hadn't considered that I might start paying attention to his. And for the first time since I saw those messages, I didn't feel powerless. I felt patient. I didn't start talking to Sophie because I wanted revenge that night, even though that's what it looks like on the surface, because the truth is I started talking to her because I saw something familiar in her eyes at that party, and it wasn't attraction. It was quiet endurance. A week later, I ran into her at a coffee shop near my office, and the encounter felt accidental enough to be believable. But when she smiled at me, there was relief in it, like she had been waiting for someone who understood what it felt like to stand next to a man who performed loyalty better than he practiced it. We sat down together because leaving would have felt awkward, and the conversation began with safe topics: work stress, traffic, mutual friends, and the weather. But beneath it was an undercurrent neither of us named. She stirred her coffee slowly and said, "Mark mentioned you two had a disagreement recently, and he seemed irritated, but he wouldn't explain why." And I studied her face carefully, trying to see whether she was fishing or confiding. "We see things differently lately," I replied evenly, and she let out a soft, humorless laugh. "That sounds familiar," she said, and there was weight in those 3 words that told me she wasn't blind. I didn't accuse Mark in that moment. I didn't tell her about hotel rooms or jokes about winning. Instead, I listened. She talked about how distant he had been for months, how he stayed out later, how he guarded his phone like it contained state secrets. She said it in a calm tone that made it worse, because it wasn't hysteria, it was resignation. "I used to ask questions," she admitted, looking down at her cup. "Now I just don't have the energy." There was something painfully honest about that, and it disarmed me in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't a naive wife oblivious to betrayal. This was someone who had felt it in the air and decided she would rather not confirm it. I felt an urge to tell her everything, to expose Mark right there, but I held back because timing mattered. Over the next few weeks, our conversations became more frequent, always plausible, always casual. Sometimes it was a quick text about a restaurant recommendation. Sometimes it was meeting for coffee because we both happened to be nearby. Nothing overt, nothing reckless. Just 2 people sharing space where honesty felt safer than it did at home. I noticed details about her I hadn't paid attention to before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way her eyes softened when she laughed genuinely instead of politely. There was a quiet strength in her that Mark never acknowledged, and I started to understand how invisible she must have felt next to his ego. One afternoon, she told me something that shifted everything. "I know he's cheated before," she said quietly, not looking at me. "I never had proof, but I'm not stupid." The air between us changed. I felt my jaw tighten, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it from her made it real in a different way. "Why stay?" I asked gently, careful not to sound accusatory. She shrugged, but it wasn't careless. It was tired. Fear, maybe. Habit. The idea that it's easier to ignore what you suspect than to blow up your life. That line lingered with me long after we left the cafe. It mirrored exactly what I had been tempted to do in those first days after discovering the affair. Ignore. Endure. Pretend. At home, Lily had started trying harder. More affection. More intentional touches. She would slide into my lap while we watched television, her fingers tracing slow patterns against my chest, her voice softer than usual when she asked if I was okay. There was still heat between us, and sometimes when she kissed me, I felt the old spark flare up in spite of everything, but it was layered now with awareness. Every touch felt strategic, every apology felt measured. Meanwhile, my conversations with Sophie felt unfiltered in a way that was almost dangerous. We weren't flirting, not openly, but there was intimacy in the honesty. When she brushed my arm one afternoon while laughing at something I said, the contact lingered a second longer than necessary, and neither of us pulled away immediately. It wasn't electric or dramatic. It was subtle and heavy. I knew what I was doing. This wasn't accidental proximity. This was positioning. I wasn't rushing toward something physical, because that would have been impulsive and obvious. I was building something slower, something grounded in shared understanding. If Mark thought sleeping with my wife was a game, then I was learning how to play without looking like I was playing at all. The first time Sophie texted me late at night, it wasn't suggestive. It was a simple message. "Are you ever scared of finding out the full truth?" I stared at that question for a long time before replying, "Only if I don't know what I'll do with it." She responded almost immediately, "I think I'm getting close to finding mine." Lying in bed next to Lily, who had her back turned but her breathing still awake, I felt the shift solidify. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It wasn't even entirely about revenge. It was about leverage. Mark had underestimated me because he thought I was predictable. He thought I would either implode or forgive. He never considered that I would step quietly into the cracks of his own marriage and listen. And listening, I realized, was far more powerful than shouting. The first time Sophie cried in front of me, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't planned, and that is exactly why it mattered. We were sitting in her car outside a small restaurant after dinner, the kind of place where nobody pays attention to who is eating with whom, and she had just finished telling me about another argument with Mark that ended the way all their arguments ended, with him deflecting, dismissing, and walking out as if her questions were inconveniences instead of wounds. She wasn't sobbing. She was quiet. A tear slid down her cheek almost reluctantly, like even her grief was trying not to take up space. "I feel invisible," she said, staring straight ahead at the windshield. "Like I'm just someone he keeps around because it looks good." I felt something tighten in my chest, not just because I understood, but because I had been made to feel the same way in my own house. "You're not invisible," I said quietly, and I meant it more than I expected to. She turned toward me slowly, and for a second the space between us felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with recognition. Her eyes were red but steady, searching my face as if she was trying to measure whether I was sincere or just another man offering sympathy because it made him feel good. "You're the only person who actually listens," she said, her voice low and unguarded. That sentence lingered in the air between us longer than it should have. I knew that this was the moment where lines blurred, where intention shifted from theory to action. I could have pulled back. I could have kept it in the realm of emotional support. Instead, I reached out and brushed my thumb lightly under her eye to catch the tear before it fell further. It was a small gesture, almost innocent, but neither of us pretended it was nothing. She didn't move away. Her breath slowed, and I felt the subtle shift as her hand came to rest on my wrist, not gripping, not restraining, just acknowledging. The silence stretched until it felt deliberate. I leaned in slowly, giving her enough time to stop me if she wanted to, and when our lips met it wasn't explosive or desperate. It was heavy, measured. Two people stepping across a boundary they both saw clearly. It wasn't wild passion like the kind I used to have with Lily when everything felt uncomplicated. It was quieter, intentional. There was tension in it, but also something almost solemn. When she pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against mine, she whispered, "This changes everything." "I know," I replied, because I did. Over the next few weeks, what happened between us wasn't reckless or rushed. It unfolded carefully, almost cautiously, as if we both understood the stakes. We met in places that felt ordinary enough not to raise suspicion. We talked more than we touched. We shared details about our marriages that we had never said out loud before. The physical side of it was real, undeniable. But it wasn't just about attraction. It was about being seen. And yet I would be lying if I said revenge wasn't threaded through it. Every time Sophie's fingers traced across my chest, every time she looked at me with a mix of vulnerability and desire, there was a part of me that remembered Mark's smirk at that party. I remembered him calling it a game. I remembered him saying I had been coasting. And there was a dark satisfaction in knowing that while he thought he had upgraded, I was quietly rewriting the board. One night, as we lay tangled in her guest bedroom while Mark was working late, she turned onto her side and studied me in the dim light. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked softly. "Is it me? Or is it him?" The honesty of the question caught me off guard. I didn't answer immediately because the truth wasn't simple. "It started because of him," I admitted finally. "But it's not just that anymore." She watched me carefully, as if weighing whether that was enough. "I don't want to be someone's revenge," she said, not accusing, just clear. "You're not," I said, and in that moment I believed it, even though I knew revenge was still part of the equation. Back home, Lily had grown suspicious in subtle ways. She asked more questions about where I had been. She touched me more frequently, almost possessively, as if sensing distance she couldn't explain. One night she kissed me with a kind of urgency that felt competitive, her hands gripping my shirt as if she was trying to reclaim something slipping through her fingers. "You still want me, right?" she asked against my lips, her voice almost fragile. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized how complicated desire had become. "That's not the question you should be asking," I replied quietly. She pulled back, confusion flashing across her face, but I didn't elaborate, because by then, the line had already been crossed, and the game Mark thought he was playing was no longer his alone. When Sophie told me she was pregnant, she didn't cry, she didn't panic, and she didn't look like a woman who had just lost control of her life. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table in her house, fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched, and said the words in a steady voice that forced me to understand the weight of them instead of reacting emotionally. "I took 3 tests," she said quietly. "They all say the same thing." For a moment, I didn't feel anything at all. The world didn't spin. My heart didn't race. I just looked at her and calculated timing, dates, conversations, the nights we had crossed that line and the way we had both pretended we could keep the consequences contained. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. She nodded slowly. "It's yours." There it was. The sentence I had imagined in darker fantasies, the ultimate reversal, the kind of outcome that would shatter Mark's arrogance in ways no argument ever could. A part of me felt a surge of vindication so sharp it almost hurt. He had treated my marriage like a game. He had joked about upgrades and coasting. Now the stakes had shifted in a way he never predicted. But Sophie didn't look triumphant. She looked thoughtful. "I need you to understand something before you react," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me sit straighter. "Mark and I haven't been a real couple for over a year." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means he checked out a long time ago," she said calmly. "He's been moving money quietly, shifting assets, talking to lawyers under the guise of business advice. I found emails. He's been preparing to leave." The words settled slowly. This wasn't a man clinging desperately to his wife while cheating on someone else's. This was a man positioning himself financially before detonating his own marriage. "He was going to divorce you anyway," I said, more to myself than to her. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "He just wanted to do it on his terms." The vindication I had felt moments earlier dulled into something more complicated. If Mark was already planning to leave, then the pregnancy wasn't the clean strike I imagined. It wasn't a bomb dropped into a stable home. It was gasoline thrown onto something already cracked. "You thought this would destroy him," she said softly, reading my silence. "I thought it would level the field," I admitted. She studied me carefully, as if measuring how honest I was willing to be. "It still might," she said, "just not in the way you're picturing." The reality began arranging itself in my mind. If she filed for divorce while pregnant with another man's child, the legal implications would be messy. Financial divisions would become complicated. Questions of paternity would drag into public record. Mark's carefully constructed exit strategy would be disrupted. This wasn't emotional damage. This was structural. "What do you want?" I asked her quietly. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I want control back," she said without hesitation. "For once." That answer hit harder than anything else. Back at home, Lily was pacing in the living room when I walked in, her expression tight. "Mark and Sophie had a huge fight," she said immediately. "He stormed out and isn't answering his phone." I kept my face neutral. "Couples fight." "It feels different," she insisted, studying me in a way that made it clear she sensed movement beneath the surface. Later that night, Mark called me. His voice wasn't smug this time. It was tense. "Have you talked to Sophie?" he asked abruptly. "Why would I?" I replied evenly. "Because she's acting strange," he said. "Like she knows something." I almost laughed at the irony. "Maybe she does," I said calmly. There was a pause on the line, long enough for suspicion to bloom. "If you're trying to play games with me, Ryan, don't," he warned. "You're the one who called it a game," I replied quietly. He hung up after that. Lying in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I felt the shift fully. The pregnancy wasn't just revenge, it was leverage. But it also meant this wasn't simple anymore. There was a child involved now, a future that couldn't be undone with a clever reveal. The plan had evolved beyond humiliation, and for the first time since this started, I realized the consequences weren't just his to carry. They were mine too. I didn't tell Mark over the phone. I wanted to see his face when the board shifted. We met at his office after hours, a place he considered his territory, glass walls and polished floors that reflected his confidence back at him. He leaned against his desk when I walked in, arms folded, trying to project control, but there was tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "What exactly are you implying on the phone?" he asked, voice low but sharp. "Because if you're trying to stir things up between me and Sophie, I swear to God." "I'm not stirring anything," I interrupted calmly. "I'm clarifying." He laughed, short and dismissive. "Clarify what? That you're still bitter? That you can't handle the fact your wife wanted something different?" I let the insult pass because it no longer carried weight. "Sophie's pregnant," I said evenly. He blinked once, processing, then shrugged. "Yeah, I know. We were trying." "No," I replied, holding his gaze steady. "You weren't." The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was heavy. His expression tightened, the first crack in his performance. "What are you saying?" he asked slowly. "I'm saying the timing doesn't work for you," I answered. "It works for me." For a second he stared at me like I had spoken another language. Then he laughed again, louder this time, forced. "You're bluffing," he said. "This is some desperate attempt to even the score." I reached into my jacket and placed an envelope on his desk, not dramatically, just deliberately. Inside were dates, hotel confirmations from nights he had been with Lily, messages that placed him out of his house during specific weeks, and medical paperwork showing the estimated conception window. I didn't need to spell it out. His laugh faded. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not," I replied. "And I didn't rush this. I made sure." He walked around the desk slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You think this hurts me?" he snapped. "You think I care if she's carrying your kid?" That was when I saw it clearly. It wasn't jealousy in his eyes. It was calculation. "You don't care about her," I said quietly. "You care about the divorce you've been planning." He froze. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said automatically, but the denial sounded thin. "You've been moving money," I continued evenly, "shifting assets, talking to lawyers under business pretenses. You were going to leave her on your terms." His face changed then, not with guilt, but with anger that I had uncovered something he believed was hidden. "That's none of your business," he said through clenched teeth. "It becomes my business when the timeline changes," I replied. "If she files while pregnant by another man, your clean exit gets complicated. Custody questions, asset division, public filings." He stared at me, and for the first time since this began, I saw fear flicker across his face. Not because of love, because of logistics. "You're playing with fire," he warned, stepping closer. "You started the fire," I said calmly. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't burning." He paced once across the office, fists clenched. "You think you're clever," he muttered. "You think knocking up my wife makes you some kind of winner?" "This isn't about winning," I replied. "It's about consequences." He stopped in front of me, jaw tight. "If you tell anyone about this, if you try to humiliate me—" "You humiliated yourself," I cut in. "You bragged about sleeping with my wife like it was a trophy. You called it a game. Games have outcomes." The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different. The balance had shifted. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't leaning back casually. He was calculating damage control. "You don't even know if it's yours," he said finally, grasping for doubt. "I do," I answered. "And so does she." That landed harder than anything else, because Sophie had already told him. He just hadn't believed her. He turned away, staring out at the dark city beyond the glass walls. For years, He had positioned himself as the dominant one in every room, the man who could bend situations in his favor. Now he was standing in his own office, realizing that his carefully structured exit plan was unraveling because he underestimated the one person he thought was too predictable to retaliate. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly. "Maybe," I replied, "but not as much as you will." When I walked out of that building, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The pregnancy hadn't destroyed him emotionally. It had destabilized him financially and socially, and that was the language he understood. He thought sleeping with my wife was a game. He just learned that I was willing to change the stakes. Sophie didn't tell me the rest of the truth until a night when the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycling on and off, and even that small sound felt like pressure building in a room that had held too many secrets. We were sitting at her dining table again, the same place where she'd told me about the pregnancy with a steadiness that scared me, and I kept looking at her hands because they weren't trembling, not even a little, which is what finally made me ask the question I'd been avoiding since Mark's office. "Why are you so calm?" I said, keeping my voice low because I didn't want it to sound like accusation even though it carried one. "Because most people would be terrified right now, and you're sitting there like you already knew exactly how this was going to land." She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched until it felt deliberate, like she was deciding how much of herself she could reveal without losing control of the narrative. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't guilty, but it wasn't innocent either, and she said, "Because I've been living with the truth longer than you think, and if I'm calm, it's because I stopped expecting fairness from him a long time ago." My stomach tightened as she continued, her voice even, almost clinical. "I knew about Lily months ago, Ryan. Not in the way you knew, not with screenshots and hotel receipts, but with enough evidence to make me stop sleeping at night, because there are patterns you can't unsee once you notice them." I felt heat rise in my chest, not the hot anger that makes you shout, but the slow burn of realizing you've been standing on a stage you didn't know existed. "You knew," I repeated, and my voice sounded strange to me, flatter than I expected. Sophie nodded and said, "I found a charge on our account that didn't match anything in our life, then another, then a series of little lies that didn't connect. And when I finally followed the thread, it led right to her, and to him, and to the kind of betrayal that doesn't explode all at once. It leaks into everything until you can't breathe." I wanted to ask why she didn't tell me, why she let me walk around humiliated while she held that knowledge. But she spoke first as if she could read the question forming. "I didn't confront him," she said, her eyes holding mine without flinching. "Because I've confronted him before, and every time he turned it into a debate I lost, and then he punished me with silence, or charm, or money moves, and I realized the only way to beat him was not to argue with him, but to outposition him." The word outposition hit like a cold coin dropped into my stomach, because it sounded like something Mark would say, and that was the moment I understood how long she'd been studying him. I leaned back, trying to steady my breathing, and I said, "So, where do I fit into this, Sophie? Because you told me you didn't want to be someone's revenge, and now it sounds like you were running your own." And she didn't deny it. She just exhaled slowly and replied, "I didn't plan to fall into you, but I did plan to stop being trapped." She rested her palms on the table, fingers spread, and that calm control in her posture made the room feel smaller. "When I started talking to you," she admitted, "it wasn't because I was lonely, even though I was, and it wasn't because I wanted to blow up your marriage, even though he deserved it. It was because you were the one variable Mark couldn't predict, because you were the friend he bragged about outsmarting, and if you were inside the situation, if you were listening, then I had leverage I'd never had before." My throat went dry, and I said, "And the pregnancy," because I needed her to say it out loud if it was true. She held my gaze and answered without blinking, "The pregnancy wasn't an accident." The words landed heavy, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, like a lock clicking shut. "I stopped protecting myself the way I used to," she continued, still calm, "because I realized that if I left him normally, he would bury me in paperwork and money games and charm, and he would walk away clean while I carried the shame, and I wasn't willing to be the one who paid for his betrayal anymore. I stared at her, a dozen emotions tangling together, because part of me admired the ruthlessness, part of me felt used, and part of me felt a dark satisfaction at how perfectly it targeted Mark's real weakness, which wasn't love or loyalty, but control. "So you used me," I said, and even though I kept my tone steady, I could hear the edge. She shook her head slightly, and her voice softened just enough to make it worse. "I chose you," she corrected, "because you were the only man in our circle who looked at him and didn't worship him, and because you were the only person who would understand what it feels like to be laughed at behind your back." The air between us thickened, and for a moment I could almost feel the old attraction flare again, not purely sexual, but the pull of being seen in your worst moment by someone who doesn't look away. Still, I needed to draw a line with words before my body betrayed me. "You should have told me," I said, and she replied, "I'm telling you now, because now it matters, and because now you get to decide whether you want to be angry at me for being strategic, or whether you want to stay focused on the man who forced both of us to become strategic just to survive him." I didn't answer immediately because she wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't blameless, and the truth sat between us like a blade laid flat on the table. Outside, the street was quiet, and inside, I felt the full weight of the twist settle into place. Mark hadn't been the only one playing a game. Lily hadn't been the only one lying, and I hadn't been the mastermind I thought I was, because Sophie had been planning her exit long before I ever opened my wife's phone, and the child she was carrying was not just proof of betrayal, but a lever she'd chosen to pull with both hands. The unraveling didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It happened in layers, like paint peeling back from a wall that had been hiding cracks for years. And the first visible fracture came when Sophie filed for divorce before Mark could finalize whatever quiet financial maneuver he had been building behind her back. He didn't see it coming that fast, and the look on his face when he was served papers at his own office in front of two junior associates who had always treated him like the smartest man in the room was something I didn't need to witness to imagine, because I knew exactly how much he valued perception over truth. He called me that night, not yelling, not laughing, but breathing hard like someone who had just realized the floor beneath him wasn't stable. "You think this is funny?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of civility. "You think you've won something here?" "I don't think anything," I replied calmly. "I'm just watching consequences play out." "You destroyed my family," he shot back, and the hypocrisy of that statement was almost impressive. "You destroyed mine first," I said evenly. "I just stopped protecting yours." There was silence on the other end, thick and heavy, and I could picture him pacing, trying to construct a version of reality where he wasn't the architect of his own collapse. "Sophie manipulated you," he said finally, shifting blame the way he always did. "She's using you to get leverage." "She didn't need to manipulate me," I replied. "You gave us all the leverage we needed." Meanwhile, Lily had started connecting dots she didn't want to see. She noticed how calm I was, how I stopped asking questions about her schedule, how I no longer reacted when Mark's name came up in conversation. One evening she cornered me in the kitchen, her voice tight and her eyes searching. "Something's happening," she said. "Mark and Sophie are splitting up and she's pregnant, and the timing doesn't make sense, and you're acting like none of this surprises you." I wiped my hands slowly on a dish towel and looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. "It doesn't surprise me," I said quietly. Her face drained of color. "What did you do?" she whispered. I almost laughed at that, because she assumed action meant chaos, that revenge meant screaming and fists and public humiliation. "I stopped being naive," I replied. "That's all." "You slept with her," she said, not asking. I didn't deny it. The silence between us felt different than it had weeks earlier when I first confronted her. Back then, I had been reacting to betrayal. Now she was reacting to the realization that she was no longer in control of the narrative. "You did this to hurt me," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't do it to hurt you," I answered steadily. I did it because you showed me exactly how little you valued what we had. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me the way they once would have. I had cried alone weeks earlier, in the quiet after discovering those messages, and something inside me had hardened since then. Word spread faster than any of us expected. Mutual friends started choosing distance, not loudly, not with dramatic confrontations, but with fewer invitations, fewer group texts, fewer shared weekends. Mark's reputation shifted subtly. The confident, charismatic friend became the guy who slept with his best friend's wife and lost his own marriage in the fallout. No one said it outright, but it lingered in every room he entered. Sophie moved forward decisively. She met with lawyers. She secured financial documents before Mark could bury them. She didn't scream or sob in public. She moved like someone who had been planning this for longer than anyone realized. And the pregnancy, once a secret, became part of the formal paperwork that complicated everything Mark had intended to simplify. At home, Lily and I lived in a strange quiet for weeks before we both admitted what had already ended. There were no more attempts at seduction, no more desperate touches in the dark. She looked at me differently now, not as the predictable husband she could take for granted, but as someone capable of cold patience. "You're not the same," she said one night, sitting across from me at the table where we had once planned vacations. "No," I agreed. "I'm not." The divorce between us wasn't explosive. It was inevitable. Papers signed, assets divided, conversations reduced to logistics. The love that had once felt solid now looked fragile in hindsight, like something that had been cracking long before either of us admitted it. Mark tried one last time to paint me as the villain, telling anyone who would listen that I had targeted his wife out of spite, that I had crossed a line no decent man would cross. I didn't argue publicly. I didn't defend myself loudly. I let the facts speak in quiet ways, because the truth was simple. He thought sleeping with my wife was a game. He never considered that I might be patient enough to learn how to play it back. The day the divorce papers were finalized, there wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors or last-minute confessions, just two signatures placed at the bottom of a document that made official what had already been emotionally dead for months. Lily sat across from me in the lawyer's office with red eyes but steady hands, and when she passed the pen back, she looked at me like she was trying to find the version of me who used to look at her with uncomplicated devotion. I didn't look away, but I didn't offer comfort either, because whatever softness I once carried for her had been burned off slowly, replaced by something quieter and more measured. Afterward, in the parking lot, she finally said what had been circling between us for weeks. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice thin but not hysterical. "All of this?" I leaned against my car and thought about the months leading up to that moment, about hotel receipts and backyard smirks and late-night whispers that weren't meant for me. "It wasn't about being worth it," I replied evenly. "It was about not being the only one who paid." She nodded once, like she understood even if she didn't agree, and then she got into her car and drove away without looking back. Mark's situation deteriorated more publicly. Sophie didn't hesitate when it came to court filings, and once paternity testing confirmed what we already knew, the narrative Mark had tried to control slipped completely out of his hands. He attempted to frame it as mutual destruction, telling anyone who would listen that I had targeted his wife deliberately to ruin him, that I had crossed a line no man should cross. What he didn't realize was that most people had already pieced together the timeline, and when the truth is laid out quietly, it doesn't need shouting to be understood. The final time we spoke in person wasn't explosive either. It was in a coffee shop near the courthouse after a hearing, two former friends sitting across from each other like strangers forced into proximity. He looked older, the confidence dulled around the edges, the easy grin gone. "You think this makes you better than me?" he asked, not angrily, just tired. "No," I said calmly. "It just makes us even." He stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to locate the friend he used to know, the predictable guy he could mock and outmaneuver. "You changed," he muttered. "I adapted," I replied. Sophie moved forward with a kind of focused determination that impressed me even when it unsettled me. She didn't romanticize what had happened between us. She didn't pretend it was some fairy tale born from betrayal. We talked honestly about the child, about responsibility, about what the future would realistically look like. There was still tension between us, still attraction, but it was layered now with something heavier than revenge. One evening, sitting in her living room while she rested a hand over her stomach, she asked me quietly, "Do you regret it?" I considered the question seriously because by then I owed her honesty. "I regret trusting the wrong person," I said. "I don't regret refusing to stay the fool." She nodded slowly, accepting that answer for what it was. The strange truth about revenge is that it doesn't heal humiliation the way you imagine it will. The first time I realized that was when I saw Mark alone at a mutual friend's event months later, standing slightly apart from the group, his laughter forced and his stories shorter. I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt something quieter, almost reflective. The satisfaction wasn't explosive. It was steady. I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply stopped letting him win at my expense. There were consequences for me too. Some friendships faded. Some people looked at me differently, unsure whether to admire the audacity or question the morality. I didn't defend myself loudly. I didn't need to. The people who mattered understood enough of the story to see how it began. On nights when everything was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I sometimes replayed the moment in that backyard when he smirked and implied he had upgraded. I remembered the way it felt to stand there knowing I had been mocked, replaced, underestimated. And then I remembered the look on his face in that glass office when he realized the stakes had changed. Revenge didn't erase the humiliation. It didn't magically restore trust or innocence. What it did was level the field. He thought sleeping with my wife was a game. He never realized I was the one patient enough to learn the rules.